The year was 1880, and the chilling silence of a Colorado winter had settled over Cripple Creek, yet an infinitely colder, more disturbing sensation was circulating amongst the remaining townsfolk. It was a macabre whisper, a terrifying secret shared only in the smoky haze of the saloon, far from the ears of the law. They spoke of the widows, not one but two, sisters, and of the men, 9 in total. 9 men who had, in the span of a single cursed year, committed the fatal error of taking an Appleby sister's hand in marriage. The terrifying truth, the forbidden reality that drove men to drink and women to lock their doors, was that by the time the first snows of 1880 fell, all 9 of those husbands had been measured for a pine box. The sisters, Elara and Maeve Appleby, had arrived in Cripple Creek just 14 months prior, seemingly innocent refugees from the desolate plains. They carried no baggage, save for a worn satchel and an unnerving composure that few remarked upon until it was too late. They were pale, startlingly beautiful women with eyes that seemed to hold the cold, deep blue of a mountain lake just before the ice takes hold. Cripple Creek, a boomtown founded on the gold rush, was a place of quick money and quicker deaths, where a man could vanish overnight and no one would truly care. But even here, where life was cheap and fortunes were fleeting, the pace of these particular deaths was horrifying. It defied all logic, all probability. It screamed of something macabre, something deeply unnatural. Was it a coincidence? A banned illness brought from the East? Or was it something far, far more sinister, something that had been meticulously and coldly engineered? The local undertaker, a grim man named Silas, was the first to realize the pattern, his hands growing numb from the endless carpentry required to house the latest victim. He noted that the sisters were always present, always weeping, yet their tears seemed to dry too quickly, replaced by that same unnerving, cold composure. The mystery of the Cripple Creek widows would become a historical cold case, shrouded in dust, greed, and a blood-soaked veil of dark suspicion that has persisted for over a century. We begin, as all such tales must, not with the end, but with the terrifying beginning of the curse they brought to the unforgiving mountains. The foundation of Cripple Creek itself was built on a lie, the promise of a golden tomorrow that rarely materialized. By 1878, it was a volatile, desperate place, ripe for exploitation. This environment, a swirling vortex of rootless men hungry for a soft hand and a warm hearth, was the perfect hunting ground for individuals who understood the mechanics of human greed and vulnerability. The sisters, Elara and Maeve, understood this instinctively. They established themselves as seamstresses, a profession that placed them in respectable proximity to the town's bachelors. Elara the elder possessed an almost unsettling stillness, her beauty sharp and uncompromising. Maeve, younger and seemingly more flighty, masked a razor-sharp intellect behind an air of delicate fragility. Their initial target, the first husband, was a prospector named Thomas Grady. Grady was not wealthy, but he owned a modest, promising claim, and crucially, he was deeply, profoundly lonely. The sisters worked in tandem. Maeve would catch the eye, drawing the man in with a carefully orchestrated display of helplessness. Elara would then cement the arrangement, offering a veneer of respectability and management that appealed to the prospector's practical nature. Grady proposed to Maeve within 3 weeks. 7 days after the wedding, Thomas Grady was dead. The official cause of death was listed simply as acute internal distress, a Victorian euphemism that could cover anything from arsenic to a spoiled piece of jerky. The sisters were distraught, their performance of grief flawless. They inherited Grady's claim, sold it immediately, and moved to a slightly larger, slightly nicer boarding house. The profit was substantial, but not so large as to arouse suspicion. They were, after all, disturbingly poor widows who had lost their love in a tragic, sudden accident. This initial success established the terrifying rhythm of the year to come. The first body was an anomaly, the second, a tragedy. The third, however, began to look like a macabre pattern, a horrifying blueprint for murder most foul. This systematic destruction of men, This calculated and cold-blooded harvesting of their meager assets demands a deeper look into the historical record, into the real events that transpired in the shadows of the mountains. The true genius of the sisters lay in their diversification of targets and methods. They understood that seriality in murder is often exposed by predictability. They never married men from the same profession consecutively, nor did they utilize the same purported cause of death twice in a row. Following the prospector, Grady, they targeted a saloon owner, an older gentleman named Arthur Finch. Finch was already ailing, prone to coughing fits that shook his already frail frame. He married Alara. 4 weeks later, the Crippens Creek Clarion reported that Arthur Finch had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a frantic wife and a business now fully owned by her. The local sheriff, preoccupied with a rustling case and generally disinterested in the minor disappearances of old men, signed off on the missing person report with a sigh. The paper simply noted that Finch had likely chased a better vein elsewhere. His absence was attributed to the chaotic nature of the gold rush, the transient existence of its inhabitants. But the town's older women, the pillars of the church, began to note the rapidity of the mourning periods. Alara, having buried one husband and seen another vanish, was ready to remarry within 2 months. This time, her quarry was a young, enthusiastic railway clerk, new to town, innocent of the local macabre gossip. His name was Henry, and he was captivated by Maeve's feigned fragility. The marriage was sealed with a quiet ceremony. 2 weeks later, Henry was found dead in his bed, the victim of what the doctor chillingly called a sudden failure of the vital systems. 3 husbands in 6 months, 3 different narratives, 3 different plausible excuses for death or disappearance in a ruthless frontier town. The sisters were operating in plain sight, using the very chaos of Cripple Creek as their accomplice. The disturbing realization for any observer in hindsight is the sheer, audacious calm with which they carried out their plan. No panic, no slips, only the icy efficiency of 2 minds working in terrifying, unholy synchronization. It makes one wonder, where did this chilling proficiency in death originate? 4th husband, a liveryman named Samuel, proved to be their first real test. Samuel was a brute of a man, physically powerful and deeply suspicious of women he considered too refined. He married Alara, convinced he could dominate her. His mistake was assuming that the Appleby sisters were fragile doves. Weeks into the marriage, Samuel grew ill. Not immediately ill, but gradually, a creepy wasting sickness that sapped his strength. He began to accuse Alara openly of trying to poison him. The arguments were loud, disturbing affairs, echoing through the thin walls of their small home. The neighbors, however, dismissed it as marital discord fueled by Samuel's drinking and paranoia. He would drink heavily, then ran about a dark shadow in the house, a coldness that clung to Alara's dress. These were the first public cracks in the sisters' perfect facade. To counteract the rumors, Maeve stepped in, providing a carefully crafted alibi of moral outrage. She began circulating a story that Samuel was not just paranoid, but afflicted by a banned, sexually transmitted disease he'd picked up from a fancy woman in Denver, and that Alara was bravely tending to him despite the danger. This historical slander, cleverly deployed, neutralized the poisoning suspicion. When Samuel finally died, vomiting blood and shaking uncontrollably, the doctor, already informed of the disease rumor, was quick to sign the death certificate. The official cause: consumption exacerbated by dissipation. But the macabre truth, the one that remains a secret in the shadows, is that the sisters had been slowly administering small, undetectable doses of arsenic, a technique requiring chilling patience and precision. The inheritance this time was the livery business, which they promptly sold to an investor keen on expansion. 4 fortunes, however modest, were now lining their pockets. The local populace was murmuring, the gossip turning horrifying, but without a body to exhume or a direct, living witness. Suspicion remained just that, a creepy whisper in the night. It's at this juncture in the sisters' deadly progression that we must pause to consider the psychological profile of the killers. a necessary digression if we are to truly grasp the escalating horror of their actions. Serial killers often share common traits, but the Appleby sisters exhibited a terrifying blend of meticulous planning and cold, calculated emotional detachment, operating in a partnership that is historically rare. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a carefully managed financial enterprise built on corpses. The sisters didn't just target assets, they targeted loneliness. They sought out men who would not be missed immediately, men whose deaths could be easily attributed to the brutality of the frontier, men whose pasts were as murky as their own. The fifth husband, a quiet, scholarly bookkeeper named Elias, was the antithesis of the liveryman. He was sickly, frail, and suffered from chronic insomnia. He married Maeve, hoping for quiet companionship. The sisters saw him as an easy mark, a low-risk transaction. His death was quick and silent, a simple sleeping accident attributed to an overdose of laudanum, a common Victorian remedy. The bookkeeper's modest savings were swiftly transferred, 5 men down. The sheer speed of these unions and subsequent funerals, 5 marriages, 5 deaths, all within 8 months, had begun to cross a forbidden threshold. People were no longer just gossiping, they were avoiding the sisters in the street. The phrase, "the widows of Cripple Creek," was being uttered not as a title, but as a silent, macabre warning. Yet the law remained dormant. Sheriff Brody, a man more comfortable chasing stray cattle than prosecuting sophisticated murder, needed definitive proof. He was a product of the gold rush mentality. Where there's smoke, there's likely just more smoke. He failed to recognize that the women were operating under a historical curse, the curse of indifference and the curse of perceived female innocence. This societal blind spot was the sisters' greatest weapon, a dark shield that allowed them to continue their horrifying spree unchallenged. The atmosphere in Cripple Creek was changing. What began as macabre curiosity had curdled into palpable fear. The Appleby sisters were now viewed with a creepy mixture of pity and dread. The fifth death, the bookkeeper, was too much, too soon. Even in this rough-and-tumble town, the pattern had become undeniable to the most superstitious. Whispers of a curse followed them everywhere. The local Native American tribes refused to even speak their names, believing the women were possessed by a malicious mountain spirit. This shift in public perception forced the sisters to change tactics. They needed a new victim who would not be swayed by the growing tide of disturbing local gossip, a man who was arrogant enough to believe he could handle the unlucky sisters. Their sixth target was Sheriff Brody's own deputy, a confident, ambitious young man named Jebediah. Jebediah was convinced the stories were just hysteria. He saw the sisters not as a danger but as a challenge, and their inherited properties as a quick way to a better life. He was blinded by lust and greed, the very traits the sisters exploited best. He began courting Alara openly, a defiant act against the town's rising dread. This courtship was the sisters' boldest move yet. By publicly aligning themselves with the law, they hoped to silence the most forbidden rumors. The courtship was short. Jebediah was proud and impulsive. He married Alara within a month, brushing aside his superior's hesitant warnings. 10 days after the ceremony, the deputy was found at the bottom of a ravine, a tragic accidental fall while checking a remote claim. The official verdict was, again, plausible, a rookie mistake in treacherous terrain. But Silas, the undertaker, noted the disturbing fracture pattern on Jebediah's skull, not the typical break of a fall, but a focused, blunt impact. Silas, his fear now outweighing his professionalism, finally took a banned step. He began to keep a private journal, documenting every mark, every creepy detail, every unnatural aspect of the sisters' deceased husbands. The journal kept by Silas the Undertaker is one of the most chilling, unexamined documents of the Cripple Creek cold case. In it, the neat, precise handwriting details not only the physical condition of the bodies, but also the macabre behavior of the sisters. For the sixth victim, Deputy Jebediah, he wrote, "The eyes of the widow Alara, they held no sorrow, only an impatient calculation as if waiting for the paperwork to clear. The fracture was not accidental. It was shaped by intent." I have seen many falls, but this was a finishing blow. This internal record, hidden beneath the floorboards of the undertaking parlor, provides the first tangible evidence of a conspiracy, the first forbidden documentation of the women's deadly intent. With the deputy's death, the sisters had not only secured a seventh estate but had also sent a clear, horrifying message to the entire town. They were untouchable, even by the arm of the law. The townspeople were now utterly convinced of the curse. The remaining bachelors of Cripple Creek either fled or became hermits. The gold rush had slowed, but a new, deadlier rush had replaced it, the rush to avoid the Appleby sisters. But the sisters, being business-minded predators, adapted once more. Cripple Creek's local supply of vulnerable men had dried up. They needed to import their next victims. They placed a discreet advertisement in the Denver papers, seeking respectable, financially secure gentlemen interested in settling in a growing mountain community. They disguised the ad as a search for business partners, not husbands, using Maeve's innocent-sounding, yet creepy signature. The seventh husband was a traveling salesman from Denver, a man named Clark, who arrived with high hopes and a substantial suitcase full of samples. He married Maeve, attracted by the promise of shared property and a beautiful wife. He lasted precisely 12 days, the cause of death, an apparent heart seizure while in bed. The quick succession of victims demanded a significant historical accounting, an explanation for the sheer audacity of this disturbing crime spree. The seventh death, that of the traveling salesman, marked a critical turning point. The sisters were now moving too fast, too flagrantly, and the long arm of suspicion was finally extending beyond the town limits. While Sheriff Brody remained willfully blind, the district attorney in Denver, an ambitious, sharp-witted man named Malcolm Thorne, took notice. Thorne was a new breed of prosecutor, concerned with statewide disturbing patterns of crime, not just local squabbles. He had noticed the macabre frequency of Cripple Creek death notices involving two specific women. Thorne initiated an unofficial, forbidden inquiry. He sent a plainclothes investigator, a former Pinkerton named Hollies, to Cripple Creek under the guise of a wealthy timber speculator. Hollies' mission was not to arrest, but to observe, to document, and to confirm the horrifying rumors. The sisters, adept at reading the social currents, immediately sensed the shift. They saw the timber speculator as their next opportunity, a man of obvious wealth. This was the largest target they had ever considered, and they became greedy, a fatal flaw in their otherwise flawless execution. They initiated contact with Hollies, both sisters competing for his attention. Alara presented herself as the competent, business-minded widow, while Maeve offered the image of the emotionally sensitive, artistic soul. Their joint pursuit of Hollies was a creepy dance of seduction, a masterclass in exploiting male vanity. Hollies, for his part, played his role perfectly, expressing an interest in purchasing one of their recently inherited properties. He delayed committing to either sister, using their rivalry to gather more disturbing information. He noted in his first report to Thorne the unnerving lack of genuine emotion, describing their grief as a thin silk veil, easily dropped. He also noticed the proximity of their previous residences to a specific, dried-up well shaft, a detail that, in retrospect, would prove horrifyingly significant. As Hollies continued his undercover investigation, the sisters, growing impatient, decided to pursue two less prominent, yet still valuable local targets simultaneously. They employed a chilling strategy of double-teaming, accelerating their macabre operation. Maeve began courting a retired miner, an old bachelor named George, who had a hidden but substantial gold reserve. Alara, meanwhile, set her sights on the town's elderly, ailing dentist, a man named Dr. Harlan. The objective was clear: two quick, quiet unions, two rapid inheritances, and then the final grand coup with the wealthy speculator, Hollies. George, the retired miner, was married to Maeve within 3 weeks. He died 4 days later. Cause: a sudden, massive stroke attributed to the excitement of the marriage. The disturbing speed was now beyond historical precedent for the area. This was the 8th husband. Then came Dr. Harlan. He married Alara, convinced her gentle hand would soothe his pain. He lasted a week. Cause: a self-administered overdose of anesthetic gases while tending to his own toothache. This was the ninth and final husband. 9 men, married and buried in less than 12 months. The horrifying scale of the crime was now fully realized. The town was paralyzed by dread. No one spoke the sisters' names aloud. They were a banned subject, a curse walking among them. But the relentless pattern, the sheer statistical impossibility of it, finally gave Thorne and Hollies the leverage they needed. Hollies, using the death of Dr. Harlan as his entry point, approached the sisters. He stated that the doctor owed him a substantial sum, and that the debt must be settled immediately, either with cash or property. This was the carefully laid trap, forcing the women to discuss their ill-gotten gains in front of witnesses. The sisters, overconfident and blinded by their lust for Hollies' perceived wealth, were about to make their first and final fatal mistake. Hollies' confrontation was masterfully executed, a brilliant piece of investigative theater designed to exploit the sisters' arrogance. He met them in the back room of the late Dr. Harlan's empty surgery, a creepy setting now stripped of its life. He pressed them on the details of their husband's assets, feigning both anger and desperation. Alara, ever the pragmatist, handled the initial negotiations, coolly explaining the legal transfer of property. Maeve, however, began to show the strain, her facade cracking under the pressure of Hollies' relentless questioning. She started to fidget, her eyes darting repeatedly towards a locked door in the corner of the room, a door that led to a small, forbidden storage closet. Hollies, sensing the vulnerability, shifted his focus from the debt to the circumstances of the deaths. He began to ask pointed questions about the frequency, the variety of the ailments, the speed of the funerals. "It seems," he observed with chilling calm, "that a curse follows you ladies, a macabre shadow." The word curse struck a nerve. Alara's composure wavered for a split second, a flicker of raw fear in her cold eyes. Maeve, unable to maintain her silence, suddenly blurted out a chilling, disturbing defense. She claimed they were simply unlucky, victims of Cripple Creek's unhealthy air and the men's own fragile constitutions. It was a weak, transparent lie. Hollies pressed harder, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. He mentioned Silas the Undertaker, asking if the sisters had ever noticed the particular shape of the injuries on poor Jebediah's skull. The mere mention of this detail, a piece of information only a handful of people knew, was the final trigger. Alara, realizing the depth of the deception, moved swiftly toward the closet door, attempting to block Hollies' line of sight. But the damage was done. Hollies knew, with absolute certainty, that behind that locked door lay the horrifying key to the cold case. The locked closet door behind the late Dr. Harlan's surgery became the focus of the investigation. Hollies, having been forcefully removed from the property by a nervous Alara, immediately reported his findings back to Denver. District Attorney Thorne, convinced they finally had enough for a search warrant, mobilized. But Thorne was meticulous. He didn't want a simple case of insurance fraud. He wanted a murder conviction, a horrifying indictment of the sisters' systematic macabre cruelty. The search warrant was served 3 days later, executed by Thorne himself and Sheriff Brody, who, now sensing his career was on the line, had finally shed his apathy. The scene was intense, the two sisters, pale and defiant, watching in silence as the lock was smashed. The closet itself was tiny, dark, and filled with a thick, creepy odor, a smell that was both metallic and sweet, the unmistakable scent of decay masked by disinfectant. Inside, however, there were no bodies. There were only stacks of bank deposit slips, title deeds, insurance policies, and, crucially, a small, worn, leather-bound book. This book, a forbidden ledger kept in Alara's precise handwriting, was the financial record of their year of murder. It detailed every asset acquired, every funeral expense, every net profit. But far more disturbing were the pages that contained notes on dosage and effect. Names like Thomas Grady and Deputy Jebediah were followed by cryptic notations: foxglove, low yield; arsenic, long burn; sudden stop, blunt force. The ledger was a chronological, horrifying confession, Yet without a body, the defense could simply argue the book was the morbid fantasy of two grief-stricken, eccentric women. Thorne needed the final, undeniable proof that the sisters had committed murder. He needed the bodies that had vanished. The question of the vanished bodies, the missing saloon owner Arthur Finch and the one body that never returned from the undertaker, Thomas Grady, became the pivot of the cold case. The sisters, confronted with the evidence from the ledger, maintained a chilling, disturbing silence. They refused to confess, banking on the lack of physical evidence. Thorne, however, had an ace up his sleeve: Silas, the undertaker. Silas, driven by fear and the macabre weight of his own forbidden journal, finally broke his silence. He revealed to Thorne the detail Hollis had noted in his first report: the proximity of the sisters' early residences to the old, dried-up well shaft outside of town. The well was a historical relic, disused for decades, its opening covered by a large, flat slab of granite. Silas explained that he had once overheard the sisters discussing the best place for disposal in a seemingly innocent conversation about old town refuse. It was a long shot based on rumor and a single creepy entry in his private diary. But Thorne took the chance. A team was dispatched immediately to the site. The work was difficult. The granite slab was immense, and the well was choked with decades of rock and mud. The townsfolk, drawn by the horrifying spectacle, watched in grim silence. The entire community held its breath, suspended in a moment of escalating dread. If the well was empty, the sisters would walk free. But if it contained what Thorne suspected, the true curse of Cripple Creek would finally be unearthed, a disturbing and final revelation of the terror that had gripped the town for a single, bloody year. This moment, the opening of the well, marks the true beginning of the macabre payoff, the point where the suspense breaks and the horror is fully exposed. The descent into the well was a descent into the forbidden history of Cripple Creek, a journey into the black heart of the sisters' macabre operation. After hours of grueling work, the crew finally breached the water table, and the air that rose from the depths was thick, noxious, and horrifying. It was the smell of decomposition, amplified by the subterranean environment. The first item recovered was not a body, but a collection of personal effects: a wedding ring identified by an inscription, a pocket watch belonging to the vanished saloon owner Arthur Finch, and a small, worn leather shoe that Thomas Grady was known to wear. The evidence was overwhelming, circumstantial but damning. Then, the shovel hit something solid, something yielding but distinctively skeletal. The first skull was brought to the surface, its bones stained a dark, uniform brown from the water and mud. It was immediately clear that this was not one victim, but multiple. Thorne ordered the entire well to be drained. Over the next 2 days, the full, disturbing truth was dredged from the earth. The well contained the skeletal remains of not 2, but 4 men, carefully stripped of identifying clothing, their bones mixed and interred with the sisters' cold efficiency. The sheer volume of the horror was staggering. The 4 recovered remains accounted for the men whose bodies had officially vanished, or whose remains the sisters had managed to intercept before the undertaker could fully process them. This discovery transcended a simple criminal investigation. It was a revelation that would forever mark the historical record of Cripple Creek with a creepy, unforgettable stain. The sisters had not only murdered their husbands, but had disposed of the evidence with a callousness that suggested not just malice, but a complete, inhuman lack of empathy. The scene at the well was macabre, a tableau of disturbing historical horror. The sight of the mud-caked bones laid out on the frozen ground finally shattered the last vestiges of denial in Cripple Creek. The townspeople were now certain they had been living alongside monsters. The 4 bodies recovered confirmed the fates of Arthur Finch, the saloon owner, and Thomas Grady, the first prospector, along with 2 other men who had either been too poor or too insignificant to have their disappearances officially recorded. This discovery allowed Thorne to piece together the entire forbidden scheme. The sisters would marry, secure the assets, murder the husband, and then, if the death could not be plausibly masked by poison or accident, they would simply ensure the body vanished. The well was their private, creepy cemetery. Their operation was far more extensive than even the most horrifying gossip had suggested. When the sisters were presented with the physical evidence, the bones, the rings, the ledger, Alara remained stoic, her face a mask of stone. Maeve, however, finally broke. The sight of the relics from the well reduced her to a shaking, sobbing wreck. She began to confess, not out of remorse but out of a desperate, selfish need to save herself. Her confession was a disturbing narrative of coercion and manipulation, painting Alara as the mastermind, the cold, macabre architect of the entire enterprise. It was the classic, chilling moment of betrayal, where one partner throws the other to the wolves to escape their own fate. This break in the case was the turning point, transforming a circumstantial investigation into a definitive murder trial that would shock the nation and seal the sisters' historical curse. If you are finding this story of historical horror compelling, and you want to hear more band and macabre histories, subscribe now, because the details of the confession are even darker than you can imagine. Maeve's confession, delivered over 3 long, disturbing days, offered a forbidden look into the internal mechanics of the deadly partnership. She painted a picture of Alara as a domineering, calculating force, a woman with an almost supernatural ability to control and manipulate. Maeve claimed she was a reluctant participant, coerced into the marriages and macabre cleanup by her older sister's icy resolve. She detailed the different methods of murder with chilling precision. The arsenic, obtained under false pretenses as rat poison, was Ilara's preferred tool for slow, subtle destruction. The accidental falls and blunt force traumas, such as the one inflicted on Deputy Jebediah, were carried out by Ilara in moments of terrifying, focused rage when a quick disposal was necessary. The account of the 4th husband, the liveryman Samuel, was particularly horrifying. Maeve described how Ilara had patiently, for weeks, mixed the odorless poison into his morning coffee, watching his deterioration with cold, clinical indifference. Maeve's confession, however, was also self-serving, a desperate attempt to mitigate her own culpability. Thorne, the prosecutor, was highly skeptical of her claim to innocence, recognizing the inherent creepy nature of their joint enterprise. He knew that even if Ilara was the orchestrator, Maeve was the necessary enabler, the honey trap that lured the prey. She was just as involved in the financial planning, just as eager to reap the rewards of the murder. The historical record, however, often favors the dramatic confession, and Maeve's testimony became the sensational headline across the country. The story of the beautiful, coerced sister and the cold, evil one was the narrative the public desperately wanted. But the truth, the disturbing kernel of the cold case, suggests that both sisters were equally culpable, bound by a shared, macabre ambition. The arrest of the Appleby sisters was a historical sensation, eclipsing the gold rush itself. The trial, held in Denver to avoid the inevitable chaos in Cripple Creek, became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed, the mood a creepy mixture of fascination and revulsion. District Attorney Thorne, a master of courtroom drama, used the sisters' own financial ledger as his primary exhibit, reading Ilara's chilling, calculated notes on dosage and profit allowed to the jury. The widows of Cripple Creek were no longer just a local macabre legend. They were the personification of forbidden female wickedness. Ilara, maintaining her unnerving composure, refused to speak during the entire trial, her silence a powerful, disturbing defense in itself. She never once broke eye contact with Thorne, giving him only an icy stare that seemed to promise a future curse. Maeve, on the other hand, was the star witness for the prosecution. She delivered her testimony with theatrical tears and dramatic collapses, clinging to the narrative of the innocent victim forced into horrifying acts. Her performance was convincing to some, particularly the female members of the public, who saw her as a tragic figure. But Thorne systematically dismantled her claims of innocence. He pointed out the bank slips, the joint ownership of the inherited properties, the seamless transition of funds. He argued that Maeve was not a victim, but an active participant, driven by the same ruthless ambition as her sister. The evidence from the well, the disturbing collection of skeletal remains, was brought into the courtroom, a macabre visual aid that finally cemented the horror in the minds of the jury. The fate of the Appleby sisters was sealed, not by one crime, but by a systematic, cold-blooded reign of terror that had lasted 12 months. The jury's deliberation was swift and definitive. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 9 counts of murder and conspiracy. The ensuing sentence, death by hanging, was met with a horrifying roar of approval from the crowded courtroom. Alara received the news with the same chilling indifference she had displayed throughout the entire process. As the verdict was read, she merely adjusted her dress and offered a slight, creepy smile that only the bailiff and the judge noticed. It was a smile of pure, macabre defiance, a final, disturbing acknowledgement of her own lethal power. Maeve, however, collapsed completely, her carefully constructed facade finally shattering into genuine, terrified hysteria. She screamed a final, forbidden accusation at her sister, claiming Alara had promised her freedom, a claim that was quickly silenced by the court officers. The historical consequence of the Appleby sisters' crimes was profound. The case became a national archetype for the dangers of the American frontier, a dark, macabre tale used to fuel both sensational journalism and conservative moralizing. It became the cold case that launched 1,000 editorials about the evil that lurks behind a pretty face. The town of Cripple Creek, eager to wash away the curse of the widows, attempted to bury the entire episode. The well was filled in and sealed with concrete, the undertaker Silas was sworn to silence, and all official records were quietly archived, effectively banned from public viewing. But the memory of the horror was not so easily erased. The story of the sisters, of the 9 unfortunate husbands, was passed down through generations of miners and saloon keepers, a whisper of historical disturbing truth that lingers in the Colorado mountains to this day. Following the conviction, the sisters were separated and placed in different wings of the state prison, a final, macabre indignity imposed by the court to prevent any further collusion. Alara spent her final months in absolute, disturbing silence. She refused all visitors, including the priest, and spent her time reading a worn copy of the Bible, though no one could tell if she was seeking solace or merely reading for distraction. Her stillness, her unwavering, cold composure became the stuff of prison legend. She was the ghost already walking the halls, a woman whose spirit had already vanished into the realm of the forbidden. Maeve, conversely, descended into a state of profound psychological decay. Her hysteria became chronic. She attempted to barter her salvation by offering to reveal the location of every single remaining asset, every piece of hidden gold, but the authorities, weary of her lies, ignored her pleas. Her final confession, scribbled on a piece of paper smuggled out by a sympathetic guard, was a creepy poem, a fragmented narrative that spoke of a dark pact made long ago, before Cripple Creek, before the gold, even before the death of the first husband. It was a macabre declaration of a deeper, horrifying history that the authorities had never uncovered. This final, disturbing detail suggests that the reign of terror in Cripple Creek was not the beginning of their crimes, but merely the crescendo of a long-running, secret campaign of destruction. The official history ends with their execution, but the real cold case, the question of their origins and their first victims, begins here, in the shadows of their final days. The forbidden question that the historical record avoids is, where did the Appleby sisters come from, and how did they acquire their terrifying, lethal skill set? Maeve's fragmented, creepy poem alluded to a dark past, a blood-drenched road from the east. Digging into the archives, one finds a curious, disturbing gap in their background. Alara and Maeve simply appeared in Cripple Creek. The official narrative was that they were orphans from the plains. Their family vanished in a tragic prairie fire. But an investigator for District Attorney Thorne, a quiet man who continued his work long after the trial, found an entry in an old Kansas state asylum registry. The entry detailed the commitment of a Miss E. Appleby, following the mysterious death of her father in 1872. The death was ruled a farming accident, But the macabre detail was that the father had been found with a small, neat puncture wound in his side, too precise for a simple farming implement. The registry notes described Alara as displaying extreme emotional detachment and an unnerving propensity for manipulation. She was released 2 years later, deemed cured. The second sister, Maeve, was listed only as a visiting relative. This single, disturbing piece of information suggests that the capacity for horror was present long before Cripple Creek. The asylum stay may not have cured Alara. It may have only provided her with the isolation and time required to refine her methods. It suggests that their year in Cripple Creek was not an anomaly, but the execution of a strategy perfected over a lifetime, a curse passed between siblings. The true cold case is not how they died, but how many others they had killed before they even set foot in the boomtown. The nature of the sisters' final, macabre act, the execution by hanging, was as disturbing and sensational as their crimes. On the day of the execution, a vast, silent crowd gathered outside the prison walls. The public, starved for a dramatic resolution to the horror, treated the event as a forbidden spectacle. Alara was led to the scaffold first. She walked with that same unnerving stillness, her head held high, refusing the hood and demanding to look upon the crowd. Her final words, uttered in a clear, carrying voice, were not a confession or a plea, but a creepy and cryptic statement. She simply said, "9 is a beginning, not an end. The gold always demands more." She then stepped onto the trapdoor herself. The sound of the drop was followed by a profound silence, a final punctuation mark on her reign of terror. Maeve, brought out an hour later, was a completely different story. She had to be dragged to the scaffold, screaming hysterically and begging for a pardon, calling out Alara's name, claiming she was forced to wear the curse. She continued to plead her innocence until the very last moment, her desperation a final, disturbing contrast to her sister's icy resolve. This dual execution provided a horrifying symmetry to their crimes, a chilling end to the deadly partnership. Yet Alara's final, cryptic phrase, "9 is a beginning," has haunted historians and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. Was it a boast, a final attempt at manipulation, or was it a literal, macabre warning that the cold case was far from over, that the seeds of their destruction had been scattered, ready to bloom again in some other forgotten corner of the American West? The forbidden lore surrounding the Appleby sisters continued long after the dust settled over their graves. The town of Cripple Creek tried to erase them, but the land itself seemed to retain the curse of their presence. Strange occurrences began to be reported near the sealed well, creepy noises at night, the sound of feminine weeping that would vanish as soon as the source was approached. Local historians, fearing the town's reputation, banned any discussion of the events, referring to the entire episode only as the Troubles. This suppression, however, only fueled the macabre folklore. Miners whispered that the ghosts of the 9 husbands were forced to wander the gulches, searching for the gold their wives had stolen, unable to rest until the inheritance was returned. The 2 sisters, it was said, haunted the old boarding house where they had planned their horrifying deeds, their pale, cold forms seen arguing in the windows on moonless nights. This descent into folklore is often where history, too disturbing for public consumption, seeks refuge. The reality of the systematic, cold-blooded murder was too much for the Victorian mind to process, so it was transformed into a supernatural tale of a haunting, a macabre entity rather than a human crime. But the underlying truth remains. The Appleby sisters were not ghosts. They were very real, very human predators who exposed the absolute vulnerability of lonely men in a brutal, unforgiving world. The historical record, however, has failed to answer one final, disturbing question. What happened to the vast sum of money they acquired? The financial cold case is the final, macabre piece of the puzzle. Over the course of the year, the sisters had systematically liquidated 9 estates. Though each individual inheritance was modest, the cumulative wealth, once converted into gold and untraceable assets, was substantial, a small fortune in the late 1870s. During the trial, Thorne had presented strong evidence of the money's existence, but the actual location of the hidden cash was never discovered. Maeve, in her hysterical final days, claimed Alara had hidden it, but she was never clear on the location. Alara took the secret with her to the gallows, her silence absolute. The money, the driving force behind the entire horrifying spree, had effectively vanished. This missing treasure became the foundation for a new, forbidden legend. Prospectors and amateur sleuths, ignoring the official warnings, continue to search the desolate areas around Cripple Creek to this day, convinced the sisters' curse is guarding a hidden stash of blood-soaked gold. The most creepy theory, one circulated in the dark corners of historical disturbing research, suggests that the money was not hidden at all, but was instead used to finance the construction of the Appleby family tomb back east. This final resting place, which records show was paid for in cash by an unnamed benefactor, is an elaborate, heavily guarded mausoleum, an architectural monument to the 9 husbands they sacrificed. This theory provides a final, macabre symmetry. The gold that was meant to provide them with a life of luxury instead bought them a shared, eternal prison. The disturbing impact of the Cripple Creek widows case extended far beyond the realm of criminal history. It had a measurable effect on the legal and social fabric of the American West. Prior to the trial, probate law was haphazard, often favoring the surviving spouse with little oversight. The speed and scale of the sisters' inheritance scheme exposed a massive, forbidden loophole. In the wake of the trial, several states, including Colorado, enacted what became known colloquially as the Appleby Rule, requiring a mandatory lengthy waiting period, often a full year, before a surviving spouse could claim a deceased partner's assets. This historical shift was a direct, horrifying consequence of the macabre realization that matrimony could be used as a financial weapon. Socially, the case reinforced the deep-seated, creepy suspicion of single, unattached women in frontier towns. The image of the beautiful, yet deadly, female was a deeply disturbing psychological development. Women who arrived alone in boomtowns after 1880 were treated with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility, as the shadow of the Appleby sisters, the curse they brought, had forever altered the social landscape. This cold case did more than just convict 2 murderers. It changed the law and permanently damaged the trust between men and women in a world already defined by loneliness and distrust. It is a banned chapter of legal history that few historians are comfortable discussing openly, preferring to focus on the gold rather than the systematic horror of the human element. The role of Sheriff Brody remains a source of macabre historical debate. Was he genuinely incompetent, a classic example of small-town corruption and apathy, or was his initial blindness to the disturbing pattern a product of a more insidious, forbidden cultural bias? The prevailing sentiment in the 1870s frontier was one that refused to believe women, especially women who presented as delicate and respectable, were capable of such systematic, cold-blooded horror. Brody's inability to see the obvious pattern, his quick acceptance of the convenient, accidental death certificates, reflects a deep-seated societal prejudice. He suffered from a failure of imagination, the inability to picture the beautiful, pale sisters as the ruthless predators they were. This bias, this historical blind spot, allowed the curse of the Applebys to thrive for 12 long, bloody months. It was only when the evidence was delivered to him on a silver platter by the external force of the Denver DA that he was finally galvanized into action. Brody was ultimately censured and forced into early retirement, his career ruined by the very case he had failed to solve. His inaction serves as a disturbing historical footnote, a creepy reminder of how institutional indifference can enable the worst kind of macabre crime. The people of Cripple Creek never forgave him, seeing his apathy as another layer of the horror that had befallen their town, a banned dereliction of duty that allowed their neighbors to be systematically harvested for profit. The legacy of Silas the Undertaker is a complex and disturbing one. He was, in a way, the reluctant hero of the cold case, the only person with the forbidden access and the presence of mind to keep a written record. His journal, with its creepy and precise descriptions of the injuries, the lack of real tears, and the unnatural speed of the morning, provided the crucial circumstantial evidence that initially led Hollies to the well. Yet Silas's inaction for so long remains a macabre shadow on his character. He saw the pattern, he suspected the horror, yet his fear, or perhaps his self-preservation, prevented him from speaking out until the very last moment. He was, after all, profiting from the sisters' reign of terror, the steady stream of funerals keeping his small business afloat. When he finally came forward, it was a profound act of moral courage, but it came only after 9 men had died. His story raises the disturbing ethical question: at what point does passive observation of a macabre crime become complicity? Silas was ultimately pardoned for his silence in exchange for his testimony, but he never truly recovered. The images of the bodies, the realization that he had physically prepared the victims of a ruthless murder spree, haunted him. He eventually sold his business and vanished from Cripple Creek, taking his horrifying journal with him. That journal, if it still exists, is the ultimate banned historical document, a raw, unedited account of the sisters' 12 months of curse and death. The final days of the Appleby sisters, leading up to their execution, contain a final, disturbing detail that lends a creepy layer of depth to their macabre partnership. Prison records indicate that a week before the hanging, Alara requested a final, forbidden meeting with her sister. The prison warden, against all regulations, granted the request, hoping for a final confession that would reveal the location of the gold. The meeting was unmonitored for 20 minutes, and its content remains a matter of historical speculation. Maeve emerged from the meeting white-faced and trembling, refusing to speak a single word about the conversation. Alara, however, seemed lighter, calmer. This exchange suggests a final, chilling act of control by Alara. She didn't confess the gold's location. She likely leveraged the secret to extract a final promise or a final piece of macabre power from her sister. Did she reveal the truth of their origins? Did she coerce Maeve into a final act of silence to protect a banned family secret? Whatever transpired in that room, it was powerful enough to silence Maeve about the gold and ensure Alara went to the gallows with her terrifying secret intact. The warden, deeply disappointed by the lack of confession, never spoke of the meeting again. This disturbing lack of information, this final, unresolved mystery, serves as a perfect narrative conclusion to the sisters' story, a final assertion of their power to withhold the truth, even in the face of death. The curse of their secret outlived them, ensuring that the cold case would never truly be closed. The role of District Attorney Malcolm Thorne in this cold case cannot be overstated. He was the one man who possessed the necessary combination of intelligence, ambition, and most importantly, the imagination, to see the horror behind the beautiful facades. He was a champion of modern forensic method, utilizing the period's rudimentary tools of investigation, the paper trail, the detailed autopsy reports, and the psychological profiling of the killers. His decision to employ Hollies, the undercover investigator, was a stroke of genius, a forbidden tactic for a public prosecutor at the time. Thorne's prosecution of the sisters was not just a legal battle, it was a crusade against the very notion of the undetectable crime, the perfect macabre murder. His relentless pursuit of the truth, his refusal to accept the easy accidental death verdicts, transformed him into a national figure. He used the Appleby trial to argue for standardized death investigations and greater scrutiny of serial inheritances. The creepy symmetry of the case, the 9 victims, the 2 sisters, gave him a narrative he could weaponize for reform. Yet, even Thorne admitted a final, disturbing defeat, the failure to locate the gold. That missing fortune, the physical proof of the sisters' ultimate motive, became his professional white whale, a final, horrifying loose end in a career-defining case. He would often remark in later life that the Appleby sisters were the only criminals he had ever encountered who seemed to have no soul, only a macabre calculation where a conscience should have been. The enduring macabre fascination with the Cripple Creek widows is a historical phenomenon in itself. The story became a staple of penny dreadfuls and sensational newspaper accounts, often heavily fictionalized to enhance the horror. These accounts exaggerated the sisters' beauty, invented non-existent dark rituals, and transformed the cold, calculated murders into a kind of supernatural curse. This fictionalization served a societal purpose. It made the disturbing reality easier to swallow. It is simpler to believe in a forbidden demonic pact than in the human capacity for such cold-blooded, systematic murder for financial gain. The very phrase, "the widows of Cripple Creek," entered the popular lexicon as a shorthand for a beautiful yet lethal woman. Even today, the cold case continues to inspire novels, documentaries, and historical tour. The preserved historical homes in Cripple Creek that the sisters briefly inhabited are often the most requested stops, imbued by visitors with a creepy sense of dread and horror. This continued obsession speaks to the primal fear the sisters tapped into, the fear of betrayal by those closest to us, the disturbing possibility that the person sharing our bed might, in fact, be planning our demise. The band truth remains that human history is often more macabre and horrifying than any fiction we can invent. One of the most disturbing elements of the sisters' methodology was their use of poison, specifically the precise, measured administration of arsenic. Arsenic in the late 19th century was the forbidden weapon of choice for subtle familial murder. Its symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, mimicked common illnesses like cholera or gastroenteritis, making it the perfect tool for a cold case killer operating in a time before advanced forensic toxicology. Ilara's meticulous notes in her ledger reveal a chilling, almost scientific approach to the poison. She experimented with dosage, delivery method, and masking agents, treating her husbands not as human beings, but as lab animals in a macabre experiment. For the slower kills, like the liveryman Samuel, the dosage was minute, ensuring a gradual wasting sickness that looked like natural decline. For others, the dose was higher, designed for a sudden, fatal, acute internal distress. This level of planning and execution, the chilling patience required to administer poison over weeks, speaks to a profound psychological horror. It was not the act of a desperate woman. It was the work of a seasoned, creepy professional killer who understood the mechanics of the human body and the limitations of 19th century medicine. This disturbing technical skill elevates the sisters beyond simple murderers into the realm of true, historical criminal masterminds. The narrative of the 9 husbands themselves, the 9 men who married the curse, is a deeply disturbing and tragic counterpoint to the sisters' macabre ambition. They were not all wealthy, they were not all wise, they were, almost universally, lonely. The frontier was a desperate place, and the promise of a beautiful, respectable wife was a temptation few could resist. From the young, enthusiastic railway clerk Henry, blinded by passion, to the old, sickly bookkeeper, Elias, seeking quiet companionship, they all shared a profound, fatal vulnerability. The sisters exploited this need for connection with ruthless efficiency. They understood that in a town where human interaction was transactional, the illusion of genuine affection was worth more than gold. The horror of their final moments must have been profound. The slow, creepy realization that the woman they had pledged their life to was, in fact, a cold, calculating killer. The only one who seemed to have died with a suspicion of the truth was the paranoid liveryman, Samuel, whose frantic accusations about the dark shadow in the house were dismissed as drunken ravings. The collective tragedy of the 9 men is a forbidden historical reminder of the terrible cost of loneliness and the ease with which hope can be manipulated and ultimately destroyed by pure, disturbing malice. The question of whether the Appleby sisters had accomplices remains a forbidden topic in the cold case history. Their operation was so seamless, so quickly executed, that some historians theorize a third party must have been involved, someone who helped with the body disposal, the paperwork, or the management of the distant assets. The disposal of 4 bodies down the deep, sealed well, for example, would have been physically taxing for 2 women to manage alone, particularly Alara, who was slight of build. Was there a forgotten lover, a family member, or a hired hand involved in their macabre scheme? The historical record offers no concrete proof, and Maeve's confession, self-serving as it was, never mentioned a third party. Yet the possibility lingers, a creepy shadow in the background of the horror show. The sheer audacity of their speed, the constant need for logistical support to liquidate and transfer assets across state lines, suggests a network. But if an accomplice existed, they were either exceptionally loyal or were disposed of as efficiently as the husbands. The lack of any other suspects or arrests, despite the intense national scrutiny, suggests that the sisters, in their isolation, were their own entire criminal enterprise, a truly disturbing and solitary partnership in death, a final testament to their unparalleled coldness and lethal capability. In the years that followed the execution, Cripple Creek continued its efforts to whitewash its disturbing past, yet the area around the well remained a source of macabre anxiety. Legend claims that on the anniversary of the executions, the sound of 9 mournful, creepy tolls can be heard echoing through the empty gulches, one for each husband who succumbed to the curse. The historical truth is that the Cripple Creek widows left an indelible, horrifying mark on the landscape and the collective psyche. They were an aberration, a banned anomaly in a frontier history already replete with violence and death. But unlike the random acts of violence that characterized the gold rush, the sisters' crimes were systematic, domestic, and utterly cold. Their horror was not the flash of a gunshot but the slow, agonizing drip of poison into a morning coffee. They turned the most sacred of human bonds, matrimony, into a financial transaction with a lethal closing clause. Their story is a forbidden cautionary tale, a chilling historical reminder that the most profound evil often wears the most pleasant face. The ultimate legacy of Alara and Maeve Appleby is the cold case they left behind. Not who killed the 9 men, but the question of how many more they might have killed had their reign of terror not been so ruthlessly, and finally, exposed. The final historical artifact connected to the Appleby sisters is a photograph recovered from the personal effects of the late Deputy Jebediah. It is a simple, faded portrait of Alara and Maeve, taken shortly after their arrival in Cripple Creek. They are standing side by side, dressed in respectable but simple traveling clothes. Their expressions are what make the photograph so disturbing. They are not smiling, nor are they frowning. They possess the same unnerving, cold composure that Sela's and Holly's would later describe. Their eyes, a startling pale blue even in the faded image, stare directly into the camera, a gaze that seems to pierce through the century. It is a portrait of complete, absolute emotional void. There is no warmth, no humanity, only a perfect, icy readiness for the macabre task ahead. This photograph, more than any court transcript or newspaper clipping, captures the true horror of the Cripple Creek widows. It is the face of methodical, premeditated evil, a creepy historical document that serves as the final, forbidden warning. Their story is a chilling descent into the historical darkness, a period piece of profound domestic horror. The trail ends here, with the execution and the buried secret of the gold. But the dread, the profound sense of unease they instilled, that has never truly vanished. It is a curse that continues to linger in the cold air of the Colorado mountains. Alara's final macabre statement: 9 is a beginning, not an end. The gold always demands more, remains the ultimate historical anchor for the unresolved cold case. It leaves us with a terrifying, open-ended conclusion. Was she referring to the possibility of a 10th victim, or was she hinting at a deeper, more profound series of crimes predating Cripple Creek? If the single Kansas asylum record is to be believed, the sisters' lethal operation began with their own father. If that is the case, the 9 husbands of Cripple Creek were merely the largest, most successful phase of a serial operation that may have spanned years and crossed multiple state lines. This realization transforms their story from a sensational frontier murder case into a profound historical horror, a disturbing and extended curse that moved westward, consuming lonely men and their assets as it went. The forbidden records of the period are often incomplete, making definitive answers impossible. Yet the creepy possibility that the true body count of the Appleby sisters is significantly higher than 9 is the final, disturbing note of dread on which this historical macabre tale must end. The gold always demands more, and the sisters, it seems, were happy to pay the price in blood. The Cripple Creek cold case remains sealed by a chilling finality. The town itself has moved on, the gold mines are mostly silent, and the memories have faded into a forbidden historical footnote. But for those who study the darkest corners of the American West, the widows of Cripple Creek represent something unique and profoundly disturbing. They are a historical anomaly of macabre perfection. Two women who operated a murder-for-profit scheme with the cold, calculated efficiency of a modern criminal syndicate, all while hiding behind the impenetrable shield of perceived female innocence. The horror they unleashed was not from a ghost or a curse, but from a terrible, human calculation. The 9 men who married them thought they were acquiring a partner and a home. They were, in fact, simply signing their own death warrants, becoming another ledger entry in a disturbing financial transaction. The truth is horrifying, the mystery remains creepy, and the gold is still vanished. We have pulled back the curtain on the banned history of the Appleby sisters, but the chilling question lingers. What truly drives a person to such a prolonged, cold, and calculating campaign of death? And in the silent mountains of Colorado, are the ghosts of the 9 husbands finally at rest? Or are they still searching, waiting for the final, disturbing secret of the Appleby gold to be unearthed?